Hi, friends. This is Dr. Arpita Gupta-Dipalma, and you're listening to my podcast, From Pissed Off to Poised. This show is for busy women physicians and professionals just like you who are ready to take control of their emotions while learning how to excel in juggling all the things they are responsible for in life. It's for overextended mamas who are trying to figure out how to work smarter, not harder. It's for multitasking women who are tired of playing the role of the angry and resentful air traffic controller, who simply want to learn how to create a life that is more calm, intentional, and joyful for themselves. My goal is to help you learn how to eliminate the overwhelm and maintain your composure in high-stress situations that you face with the demands in your day-to-day life. Because I get you guys, this was totally me. You are not alone. I invite you to embark on your journey of transformation with me. Enjoy the listen. Hi, guys. Welcome back to another episode of From Pissed Off to Poised. I am excited to have you guys here today. I'm also super excited to have my guest and friend, Dr. Kemia Sarraf. As I've talked about, I don't have a lot of guests typically on this podcast, but who I have hand-selected are individuals that have really impacted the way I see things with regards to how I teach and coach my clients. And one of the shining stars, I will say, in my journey was Dr. Sarraf, because with her and through her, I learned a lot more than I ever thought I needed to know about trauma and how trauma impacts us as an individual, as a society, as a whole. And I found her speaking and the way she spoke about trauma and teaches about trauma to be so eloquent and so impactful that I knew immediately that she needed to be on the show. So I am going to let Dr. Sarraf do the honors of giving you her bio and her background, because I will probably butcher it because she's amazing and there's so many things. But welcome, Dr. Sarraf. Kemia, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. And that's such a kind introduction that I feel like I really can pretty much leave it at that. I will say that most folks call me Dr. K because it's easy. And Kemia works really great for our purposes as well, my friend. I am the CEO of Lodestar, which is a company that I founded back in 2016 to address the really, really high levels of burnout and harm and pain and shame and everything that goes along with it that I was noticing in our colleagues, in our physician colleagues. I am an internist by training. I'm also a public health professional for love, because I love public health. And I love the opportunity to be with you in this space for this purpose. I think it's an exciting topic, and I think it's such an important one because it's so often misunderstood. So I'm excited that we're going to get to talk about this.
Well, I love it. And I'm, again, so thankful and excited you're here. And I think I want to just dive right in and just start. I think we've discussed, and I've kind of told you the framework of what I talk about here with this podcast is to really normalize anger and how this is part of the human experience and how it's not necessarily wrong or bad. But more specifically, with regards to your experience with trauma, as the trauma-informed physician, how would you define anger in terms of what it looks like to us and how it signals us kind of as an alert system?
Yeah. We talk about anger as an emotion, right? And when we telescope out and we start looking at how we are enculturated to think about emotions, I think it matters. I think this really, really matters. Because most of us, and I think I'm going to use some generalizations here, and I'm going to ask your listeners to please grant me some grace around generalizing. In general, when we think about how we learned to move with our emotions growing up, I think that there were certain emotions that we were both explicitly and implicitly taught were good, and some that we were explicitly and implicitly taught were bad. And I think that when we begin breaking that further down along traditional gender lines, it gets even more demarcated in terms of what is good and acceptable and what is not acceptable. And so again, using these generalizations, as women, often we are taught that anger is an inappropriate, is a bad emotion for us to have in any form of expression, right? I just made a very gendered statement, and I'm acknowledging the fact that I am generalizing around this because the generalization matters a little bit in this case, particularly when we're talking about how this impacts women. We can gender this around how historically men have been taught to approach and process certain emotions like tenderness or sadness, right? And those emotions, which may be more accessible and available to women, have often been shunned in and for men in more male stereotype. This matters because we need to reframe entirely how we think about the full spectrum of emotions. And I think when we do that, it allows us to begin to recognize emotions differently. And then we get to the neuroscience of it, right? So when we take emotions away from this concept, this framework of good emotions and bad emotions, and we begin thinking about them in terms of energy and maybe degrees of pleasantness. So we grid it out, right? Yeah. So most of your listeners, I'm going to guess, are probably clinicians, physicians, scientists. So let's grid pleasantness across the x-axis, and let's grid energy on the y-axis. So anger might be considered a high or higher energy, unpleasant emotion. It's one that sort of signals something to us, right? That isn't usually a pleasant signal, and it's high energy.
Yeah.
Right? That means it's a data point. I think there's an exhale around emotions as data, because when we begin to frame the concept of emotions as data, then they become something that we can notice, give a name to, give an appropriate name to, and then get curious about. We can practice all of this. It doesn't happen overnight. This is a learned skill. This is a discipline that we practice over time. When we begin to view it through this framework, even really, really, really high energy anger, let's call it rage, becomes a data point, right? Yeah. So my rage, let's just go to me. I grew up in a time, right, when rage expressed in, me as a young woman was not an acceptable thing. Doesn't mean I didn't feel it.
No.
Just meant that the outlets for it were not deemed societally acceptable. And so I was taught and retaught all of the ways that you package that up, suppress it, squish it down. Okay. The problem is, right, eventually that stuff is going to bubble somewhere. We turn it internally and it becomes self-harm in some form or fashion. And there's lots of different emotions that we do that with. Or eventually it sort of explodes out of us. I tend to be an exploder. It sort of explodes out of us in this like radioactive cloud that injures literally everybody around us.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When we begin to learn and practice, rage is, so I just got the signal in my body that I'm really angry about something. We get curious about what is it? Okay, so that's a really important inflection point for each one of us.
Right.
What is it? Can I get curious about what this is? I do not become enraged because someone spills milk. I become enraged because something precious, valuable, sacred to me is under threat. That can be a value system. That can be my time and my energy.
It can be a cumulative effect of the other things that are impacting you as well, right? So like if you're down to the wire, overworked, overextended, if you've had other emotional activators that have, upset you in terms of baggage, like if you're dealing with something that's personally very emotionally or hard, not necessarily a trauma, but you're exhausted from that, depleted from that, you're going to have less to pull from. And what you're talking about here with regards to the energy that I'll put it in the show notes. It's the feelings grid where it has plotted out the emotions with regards to the level of energy on the X and Y axis. And then it also has the pleasantness scale at the bottom. So you can see that range, that grading of the emotions, which it's super powerful to be able to notice, oh, hey, this is the difference between rage versus being a little ticked off, right?
100%.
So,
yeah. And that connection that you just made there, which is such an important piece of this, right? And a great place to sort of launch from naming the emotion into like, what are the things that are going to amplify the impact of that emotion, right? Is that sort of continuum from stress to toxic stress, right, into harm. And so Resmaa Menakem gives us this really great equation. I call it an equation around, for him, it's a definition around trauma as anything that is occurring that is too much, too fast, too soon, too long, without enough of what should have occurred or without enough of what we needed that would have been resourcing. When we begin to think about what are the things that resource us, that disrupt that continuum from stress, which helps us to grow and be healthy, into toxic stress, which can begin to harm us, and that continuum moves on into trauma, which becomes embodied and sets us up to be more reactive. We think about the other things that disrupt that continuum. Rest is a resource, and there are lots and lots of different forms of rest, including the type of rest that allows us to reflect on what's happening, to plan for what comes next, to make decisions about how we manage our energy. Connection with others is a resource. Other people are an incredible resource. Why? Primarily because when I sit down and I start talking to you and I say, you will not believe this thing that's happening and I'm losing my mind, you look back at me and go, oh, girl, same. I get it. I've been there. And suddenly I don't feel quite so alone, right? Our capacity to co-regulate with each other, that beautiful limbic system that we have that encourages us to connect, right, is an untapped resource often. So there's a pretty lengthy list of these things. And as we start to tap into those resources, as we know what those resources are, that also allows us to move back into curiosity, right? And into choice. Mm-hmm. Choice is incredibly disruptive of toxic stress. It's incredibly disruptive of overwhelm. It's in that choice and the pause, frankly, that precedes the choice, where we start to realize, oh, it feels like everything's on fire. Everything is not actually on fire. And we choose how we're going to prioritize. We choose what we're going to do to sort of utilize that anger. Because remember, we're talking about a very high energy state. Energy is very useful. My rage is incredibly useful to me when appropriately directed. It gives me the energy to create and drive changes that need to be created.
I think this is a great place to like kind of even differentiate a little bit where anger, how it manifests differently in people who have experienced trauma versus a person who really hasn't experienced a lot of trauma but has anger. What differences have you noticed in individuals with how they react when they have that history of trauma?
Yeah. I want to clarify one thing. The data tell us that 80+%, I think with the exact number was 86% of the adult population have experienced a traumatic event, just a traumatic event. So let's normalize a little bit that trauma is ubiquitous. I think we tend to equate trauma and victim, which is why some folks want to stay away from it. It makes them feel some type of uncomfortable. I also think while we don't want to normalize trauma as something that is okay, we also want to acknowledge that just by that definition of trauma as event, the majority of adults have experienced a traumatic event. And trauma is much more than event. Trauma is exposure. Trauma is the cumulative compounding dose. In medical school, we learned that the dose makes the poison, right?
Exactly.
The cumulative compounding dose of toxic stress over time becomes embodied in us and then starts to show up reactively in exactly the same way as exposure to a traumatic event does. So that's
Yeah.
important to make note of.
I mentioned this in my last episode that, we've all experienced trauma. It's just, I remember when we did our first episode together with you on Doctors Living Deliberately, that we were talking about this. And my aha was, oh my gosh, med school is a trauma. Like a lot of times we will not equate some of the experiences we had as trauma because they just don't seem severe enough. So when we can back it up and even just recognize that certain experiences, as you said, if we don't have enough resources and it's coming at us too fast, too much, too soon, that's what is essentially kind of the definition of trauma. And that's where it is so different for each individual. And so from that, if we look at how anger can manifest differently in people who've experienced trauma, what you just said, your last sentence was so powerful because it depends on how intense it was for that individual, despite the actual event, and how it's become embodied in us. I just wanted to make that point clear that, we're trying to help people understand that this is not only sexual abuse or a motor vehicle accident or murder. Just because you don't have that level of trauma doesn't mean you haven't had trauma, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's such an important noticing to have. And Dr. Gabor Mate, who is probably one of the foremost thinkers about the impact of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences over the course of a lifetime, frames it this way. He teaches us that trauma is not what happens to us.
Mm-hmm.
Trauma is what happens inside of us as a result of what happens to us. Right. And so when we think about what happens inside of us as a result, well, that depends. You and I could move through the exact same experience, medical school, for example,
Right.
and you might have one experience with it. We could be in the exact same med school class, the exact same, sitting right next to each other, having the same experience, as closely related as possible, same experience. And it might land as extremely traumatic to me and a nothing sandwich to you because we are differently resourced. Our previous experiences are different. How well resourced we feel in the moment is different, right? So this is where we start to say there's no trauma Olympics. That's first thing, right? We don't need to get into comparative suffering.
Yes.
And we don't tell each other, we don't look at each other and say, well, I don't know what your problem is. That was not that big a deal. Right? Because it might not be a big deal for me and it might be a very big deal for you. And that should be enough. That should matter to me. And it does. When we approach others from that perspective, but most importantly, when we approach ourselves from that perspective, there's a gentleness that allows us to then begin to look at what are the big emotions that start to arise out of those places of harm. So you ask the question, how does this show up? How does it show up differently? Right? I don't think we need to worry about that as much as we need to acknowledge that when a place of harm is activated, when our nervous system gets activated in response to a threat, because that's what harm does, is it upregulates our nervous system to scan for threat. When the nervous system is overwhelmed, when the amygdala gets it's more complex than this, but we're going to simplify. When the amygdala gets activated in response to a real or a perceived threat, there's some pretty dominant things, emotions that begin to show up. Anger is one of them. So activation of that threat detection system can look like anger. Activation of that threat detection system can look like apathy and avoidance. Activation of that threat detection system can look like dissociation, moving away from, compassion fatigue, burnout. We label it all kinds of different things, right? Every single one of us is hardwired to scan for threat.
So, Kemia, it sounds like it's not necessarily people who've experienced trauma that they necessarily show up differently with regards to the impact or the intensity of anger or any of the outwardly reactions. Rather, it is, that activation of that threat detection system that sets them down their well-developed neural pathway, whether it be anger or dissociation from the environment or the world around them, avoiding things, or, just plain apathy, just not being present to keep themselves safe, right? As they're defense mechanism. So,
Yeah.
the next logical question from here is just to ask you, then how can somebody know? It sounds like, the anger response might just be very similar in a sense, not necessarily different because of a past trauma. So how would somebody know if their anger is a healthy response versus a sign of a deeper, maybe unresolved trauma that requires more attention?
It's such a great question and a great way of framing it, because it allows us to sort of draw back away from the T word. Sometimes freaks people out, right? You say the word trauma and people freak out because they think that the only way to respond to a trauma is deep therapy. And listen, I am a huge proponent of deep therapy. So I want to say that. Trauma responsive engagement, though, which is very different than therapy and which is a set of skills that any one of us can learn, allows us to have the skill to slow down enough, to pause long enough to activate our curiosity about what's going on. Mm-hmm. I like to sometimes say that curiosity is a superpower, and the pause is the threshold, is the doorway that we cross into that curiosity. So the pause is about safety planning. And when we safety plan, we do that in advance, right? I don't safety plan for a fire to occur in my house when it's happening. I safety plan for a fire to occur in my house long before that, right? Yeah. We safety plan for when, not if. And I think that's a really important distinction. If I safety plan for when my threat detection gets activated, right? For when my prefrontal cortex goes more or less offline, it becomes unavailable to me. If I safety plan for when that occurs, not if it's going to occur, then when it occurs, what I do next is reflexive, right? Yeah. I might notice it much sooner. So here's an odd quirk of our training. It's not an odd quirk. It's actually, we're trained very deliberately. We stop paying attention to our bodies.
Totally.
Right? Many physicians are completely dissociated from everything that happens from the neck down. This is deliberate in our training, right? We are trained to ignore the signals for sleep. We're trained to ignore the signals for hunger, for thirst, for needing to pee, right? We're trained to ignore all of those normal bodied, embodied signals. What happens as a result of that very intensive training is we sort of shut down the signals that are coming, the wisdom that's coming from our body. Well, guess what happens? When we are activated, when our threat detection system is activated, it doesn't start in my brain. Your listeners can't see me pointing to my forehead, but it doesn't start in our prefrontal cortex. My prefrontal cortex doesn't say, oh, hey, Dr. K, you're getting activated. Mm-hmm. What happens is my heart rate ticks up. What happens with me is my throat starts to close off. Every single one of us has a very early physical tell that we are becoming activated in reaction to some sort of real or perceived threat around us. Yeah. When we learn to tune into those early embodied signals, then we can get curious. So what I have learned to do and what we teach others to do is, what's the earliest thing that shows up in your body when you're feeling threatened? When you're feeling physically threatened, yes. But most of us aren't physically threatened on a daily basis. Most of us, though, do experience some sort of social threat, rejection threat, othering threat every day. Mm-hmm. And so where does that show up? I just told you, it starts to show up in my throat. Other people talk about tingling in their hands, that pit of the stomach, gut feeling. You have a tell. Learn your tell. Yeah. Tune into your tell. Know that that is actually not something to ignore or suppress. That's your body saying, hey, yo, something's happening. When we approach it from that gentler perspective, like, okay, I hear you, then we can stop and get curious, pause and get curious. That's that safety moment, right? Am I actually in danger? Or is my overstimulated brain reacting to keep me safe? But in that reaction, is it perhaps misreading, miscuing, misdiagnosing how much danger I'm in, right? Yeah. We start to deliberately bring prefrontal back online, and that's that gateway to choice. Yep. I then get to choose how I'm going to respond. My anger, I said this earlier, my anger is not something I fear. My anger unleashed, undirected, misdirected is inappropriate and is something that I work very hard to notice and channel,
Yeah.
right? Anger is a high energy emotion. And if I channel it correctly, I can do very good things with it. If I don't, I can do a lot of harm. That's the differentiator.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting. I'm just gonna quickly relay this because you're speaking of this. I had an event that I went to probably about a month ago, and it was a situation where I was, let's just say, an outsider in terms of my culture, my religious beliefs, all the things, very, very separate. And I've gotten to the point now where when I'm in these situations, it doesn't really bother me because people are allowed to be wrong about me, is my thought. That they're allowed to
Mm-hmm.
do their thing and I'm doing my thing. And I realized I stayed in the scenario just because it was an event that involved people that we were close to, et cetera, et cetera. And afterwards, I just handled this like I didn't even have the awareness that this was impacting me. I got home that Sunday night. I was exhausted and went to bed by 8 o'clock. I woke up the next morning in a complete brain fog, totally could not get my act together. I really felt like I was almost, like you said, disassociated. I was just not on point with being able to be productive and do my day. The next morning, I worked with my coach, and I didn't even really have the awareness that this might be linked to what happened over the weekend. And it very much so, when I allowed myself to drop in and pause and focus on my body and just allow what is coming up for me, it very much so was linked to experiences that I had as a child related to not being in the circle of people that I felt like I was belonging to, not being accepted with or being rejected from. And I had no awareness of that at all in the moment. So I also want to just bring to light that there are situations that might come up that's such a protective measure for you that you may not even notice it. And you need the assistance of a therapist, a coach, somebody else to help you kind of recognize and process through it.
This is such a beautiful example. Thank you for sharing that because it is such a beautiful example also of the energy drain, right? So why did you wake up in a fog? Because it is energetically exhausting, right? To be in a state of high alert in the way that you were, right? To protect in whatever way it was, even quietly. It is very, very energetically exhausting. So this actually gets to some really big sort of workplace issues and cultural issues, right? Because true belonging is the gateway to productivity, is the gateway to all of the outputs we want. But we tend to treat it as an afterthought. Or we put inclusion and belonging into that category of have tos. We
Mm-hmm.
have to do it because legal says we have to do it, right?
Right.
And so what it ends up sounding like is, well, come in, fine. What do you need? What accommodations do we have to give you? Right? That's what it sounds like. That's how it lands. That's very othering.
Mm-hmm.
Genuine, true, inclusive belonging sounds like, oh my gosh, where have you been?
Yeah.
We need you. We
Yeah.
want you. We want your differences. We need your differences. What does it take? What do you need to want to be part of this?
Yes.
Right? I think we send a lot of inadvertent exclusion signals. Well, oftentimes the signals of exclusion are so subtle we don't even realize we're doing it. And I mean I'm including
Oh.
myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When we begin to appreciate that neurobiologically, every single human walking this planet, I'm going to say that again. Neurobiologically, every single human walking this planet is hardwired to seek safety through belonging. When we understand the implications of that, we start to approach each other differently and we start to understand ourselves differently.
Yeah.
I think it is a key, really, to beginning to have more challenging conversations, more cohesive teams, deeper, more meaningful, more impactful relationships, because we see that when we pick up those signals of exclusion or those signals that you're about to be thrown out of group, we don't want you, you're not needed, you're not one of. When we start to pick those up, that is going to activate that same path in our brains as the face-eating bear, as the apex predator. And once that's fully activated, I actually can't access reason, ration thinking.
100%.
And that also is a very energetically depleting state. I am zero surprised you woke up Monday exhausted.
I think what was just so enlightening is to see that despite doing this work and helping others with these sort of issues and concerns as they come up for them, that it still can impact even the people involved. It impacts us all. And so just being okay and being able to accept that and notice that, that's the beauty of this, that we're all in it together in a sense, doing the work. So,
and to scaffold yourself so that you have some place to figure it out, right? I always talk about this. This is a becoming. There is no state of being. This is a state of becoming. I am going to be becoming trauma responsive for the rest of my life. If there's a finish line, I haven't found it.
Right. Oh yeah, totally. And it's funny, like I'll have conversations with my husband. And I'm like, this man probably thinks I'm crazy, but I literally will link so many different ways that I reacted or responded to a situation to something that has happened in my past. And having that awareness now has really enabled me to show up in a completely different way, like with so much more compassion and grace for myself as well as for other people. And I think that's what's the key here. Like, so we talk about that awareness. You start with the awareness. That very first episode that I talked about with this podcast begins with the awareness. So the recognition, the recognition, the regulation, and the reconnection. So this is
absolutely
what we talk about. But well, Kemia, I have really enjoyed having you on the show today. Tell our audience a little bit about where they could reach you, or if they want to learn more about your programs and what you do in this world.
You can find us at Lodestar, LODESTARPC.com, lodestarpc.com. And the majority of what we do is professional development. We do a lot of coaching. We have an incredible group of coaches who do one-on-one coaching. And I think even our coaching has a lot of professional development in it, because that's just what tends to happen when professionals connect with each other. And we have a real passion for developing coaches, developing leaders, developing human beings.
Well, I appreciate you, and I appreciate everything that you bring to the world. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with my audience today. And I look forward, maybe we'll do it again sometime down the road.
I would love that. I loved talking to you. Thank you so much.
All right, my friend, take care. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of From Pissed Off to Poised. Remember, transformation is a journey, not a destination. So enjoy the ride. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review From Pissed Off to Poised on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback supports my mission to get this podcast out to help other women physicians and professionals like you on their path to creating a more peaceful life with more intention and more joy. I enjoy reading every message I get with your input and feedback on my journey, so keep them coming. And if you have a friend who might enjoy the listen, please share this episode and show with them. Lastly, if you want to learn more about my coaching programs and course offerings, check out my website at www.thoughtworkmd.com. Feel free to reach out to me to learn more about investing in yourself through one-to-one coaching so you can start living the life you've always wanted. This show is for general educational and entertainment purposes only. Life coaching is not a substitute for therapy or medical treatment.